All right, we're going to start with Unit 3, Political Geography. Again, we'll have a series of videos and lectures. A lot of this will follow the documents that you guys have on AP review documents. If you want to use those while you follow along, that would be great. All right, so let's talk about political geography. We're not talking necessarily about politics itself, Republican, Democrat, Independent. All right, what we're talking about is the organization, right? The organization of political systems, right? And the different influences that might be had on those systems based upon geography, right? So we're going to start with some basic definitions, right? If you guys recall way back when, we started with definitions of what a country or a state is. Right, and a lot of times you may see state and country used interchangeably. Country sometimes is referred to as an identifiable land area. So if you look at the map over here, Serbia in this map is an identifiable land area. Right, so here's the land, there's the boundaries, that's a country. Right, if we're going to talk about a state, we're going to talk about something more. Right, we're going to talk about a defined area. That's part of it, but we also want to add in the fact that you have a permanent population, right? That you also have an established government that exercises sovereignty over that particular area, right? Sovereignty is just the ability to control, right? Both politically and militarily, right? I can defend my country. People can't come into my country or my state without my explicit permission, whether that be an individual or a law. Right? So sovereignty is most important in order to qualify as a state. Right? We also want to look at the definition of nation, and sometimes we use country, state, and nation interchangeably as well, but for geography we're not going to do that. Right? A nation is a population, a people who see themselves as one because they have a shared history, shared circumstances, shared genetic, maybe that might be what unites them, right? So if you look over on the left, right, we see the area that is the Kurds, the Kurdish area, right? The Kurds are a nation. They are a people who see themselves as one, right? They have a shared background, a shared ancestry, right? They do not have a boundary. They don't have a defined or identifiable land area, right? That is theirs. That this is area that belongs to these countries, right? That where they sit. So that is not. That's a difference. A nation and a country or a state are not the same thing, right? There are different ways that we can describe these particular states, right? For the Kurds, we can refer to them as a stateless nation, right? They are a group of people who see themselves as one, but they have no identifiable land, right? They do not have a boundary. They do have a government. They do have a permanent population, but they have no sovereignty. They are not allowed to defend their particular territory. We can also look at the Palestinians as an example of a stateless nation, right? We can also look at a nation state where the idea of state, right, a boundary, a government, and a permanent population coincides with a nation, people who see themselves as one. It doesn't often happen. Probably the closest two examples would be Japan, where 97% of the people are ethnically Japanese and speak the Japanese language. Possibly Denmark. Denmark also is overwhelmingly Danish. Right, so they may be a nation state, but that doesn't often happen. Most of the time you have what's called a multinational state, like the United States. We have a state of many nations. Right? We have groups of people from all over the world, plus the people who were obviously originally here, Native Americans, right, are of various different nations. So we are a state of many different nations. We are not a nation state. If we're going to talk about the idea of a nation, we also want to talk about the idea of nationalism, right? Nationalism is a fairly strong identification with who you are, right? It is an idea that almost I am better than, It's okay to say the United States is the best country in the world. Everybody loves their country, wants to think the best of their country. But when you start to then use that in somewhat of an idea of suppressing others, right? If we look at World War II, Germany and the United Kingdom very much engaged in nationalism to where it became this battle of who could be the better, who had the better navy, who had the bigger army. And they kept building and building until at some point in time, of course, they clashed, right? So nationalism is not necessarily a bad thing unless it's taken to an extreme, all right? Let's also then look at, right, how we establish boundaries and how we establish boundary disputes. All right, you probably remember this from your book. It's a little different way of looking at it. Different types of boundaries. Antecedent existed before, right? Meaning something like there was a river between them, like the United States and Mexico, or Texas and Oklahoma. We looked at the boundary in between Malaysia and Indonesia on the island of Borneo, right? That ancient forest that had physically separated the people before they ever put a boundary there, right? Subsequent is something that comes after, right? Ante before, subsequent after, right? Lots of times that they are, that boundary will kind of move, and over time we'll get together and we'll finally figure out, what the boundary should be. Superimposed, what we saw a lot in Africa, where countries just came in and plopped boundaries, whether they used a geometric type of system like lines of longitude and latitude, or whether they just said, oh, here's a river, let's just do it this way, right? Where you are doing it without necessarily any thought to the cultural aspects, right? If there are different ethnic groups that may get along or not get along, whether you're going to separate a group of people. So we are not looking at anything about the cultural landscape to make those decisions. And a relic boundary used to exist, but doesn't exist anymore, but you can tell that there's something different. Right, if you go to the country of Vietnam, I've never been there, but I understand if you go along the border between the former border of North and South Vietnam, right, you can see the difference between the South Vietnamese democratic government, what the infrastructure looks like, what the houses look like, the roads, what have you, and then go over to the North former communist area, and you can see that the houses are different. Same thing with East and West Germany. Apparently, even though the boundary doesn't exist anymore, you can still tell what it is. All right, let's different types of boundaries that we can use, of course. Geometric, lines of longitude and latitude. Physical boundaries like mountains, rivers, right, things like that. There are also boundaries you can't see that you'll probably come across in your book, what they call ethnic or cultural boundaries. Right? It's not necessarily that there's anything on the ground that says this group here, this group lives here, but that's just the way they are. And you know that this particular area is inhabited by this group of people, and that one's by that group of people as well. All right, different types of disputes that we've talked about before. Obviously, people can fight over boundaries. If they think that this boundary was improperly imposed, and they can fight over it. We know in Sudan and South Sudan they fought to establish a border between the two different countries. But we looked at 4 different kinds of boundary disputes. Definitional, right, where we don't agree on the language of the definitional document, the treaty probably, right? We don't agree on what that definition actually means. We're fighting over the language. Locational, right? We don't necessarily disagree over the language, but we disagree on what it means and where that border is supposed to be. Right? We know that a lot of treaties were ancient documents, and so saying it, that it was from the 5 steps from the rock that looked like a bear. I don't know if that rock doesn't exist anymore. Where again does that border exist? Operational border disputes. How do we use the border? Right? How if one country says, I don't want people coming in to the country anymore. I'm not going to let you use the border this way. then that can lead to a dispute. And the last one is allocational. That's probably the biggest one. That is, if there is a resource that straddles the border. In our book, we looked at oil between Iraq and Kuwait. I've read a bunch of articles lately regarding the rivers that come together in the Three Gorges Dam. That the allegation is that China has been withholding more and more water from that river and also from the Mekong, which flows into Cambodia and Vietnam. And so that places downstream from China, and those countries have been getting less and less water and having issues with drought and famine. All right, those are things that you need to know and be able to discuss how those particular borders will work. All right, the next section we're going to look at is types of governments, right? There are divided up pretty much into two, right? Federal government, which is what the United States has. Basically, you have a central government. It can be strong or not strong. The United States has a fairly strong central government with equally, not equally strong, but different areas of state governments that have great power. If we were to look at Switzerland, it has it's what they call a confederation. It is a federal government. There is a central government, but it's not very strong. And it is pulls together what are called cantons, which is basically individual states within Switzerland, and they can pretty much each do what they want. There is no real power within the central government. All right, so federal government, like the United States, two levels. Federal government, state government. Powers are shared, right? In our system, we have a constitution. The Constitution is a document that acknowledges that all the power in the United States rests with the people and the states. Basically with the people, some with the states, but then we give power or grant power to the federal government. If we don't give them the power, it remains with the states. Right? We have different sets of laws. We have federal laws that come from the federal government, and we also have various state laws. A unitary government is a government that really only has one level. It has an incredibly strong central government with very little, if any, power to the states. In fact, the only power those states or confederations or whatever we want to call them might have is the ability to enforce the federal law. So they really don't have very much power at all. The power coming away from the federal government to the states, we call that process devolution, right? As that power moves away from federal governments and it moves to the state governments, right? We're going to have some level of what are we going to call devolution. Okay? Let's see what's next. I may stop because we're going to run out of it. Yeah, I'm going to stop here because colonialization is going to take a little while. Colonialization is something that affects pretty much every place in the world. Very little has ever not been touched by colonialization. So we're going to stop here and then we're going to move on.